Okay, finally finished the book study, but all I gotta do is make these fucking videos. This video is just the summary of the chapters, which is going to be available for free on my Patreon as well. But any of the extras, you'll need a subscription. And then the critical thought, you will need to subscribe to the Diabetes Foundation tier. Because this book is actually a good resource into understanding the WW strain of diabetes and ground zero. It is. Okay, so with that said, chapter 1. Mistresses in the Making, I actually call The Making of the Karen, ground zero for diabetes type A, the WW strain. So in this chapter, Dr. Stephanie Jones Rogers uses testimony not only from formerly enslaved people and their descendants, but also there is testimony from a white man who was an architect, and he described a pleasant white girl, I believe I remember correctly, 12 or 13 years old, turning into a demon and then back to her pleasant self. While talking to the white man, she noticed a black man who was likely enslaved, walking on his own, likely handling some his captor's business. And she didn't like that. So she told him to turn around and return before she has him whipped. And then there's another story of a toddler demanding her father remove the ear of her caregiver, an enslaved woman, and replace her. She was 2 or 3 years old. Chapter 2, I Belong to the Misses, I called These Are My Captives. So chapter 2 used records of white people to illustrate how well insulated white women were when it came to protecting their human property and the wealth that their captives produced. With the law created by white men, they were protected from creditors and their insolvent husbands who were incompetent and couldn't manage the business. So basically, men set up a system to protect their daughters from men like them. Chapter 3, Mrs. Done Her Own Bossing, I called The Womb of Satan. So this chapter destroys the myth of a fragile, delicate white woman. It gives details into how serious white women took their only identities as slaveholders, and they didn't allow anyone to devalue their property, including the law. It illustrates how white women wore a mask of benevolence to hide their vileness and to preserve the value of their human property. They weren't that delicate. So this story is actually in chapter 1, I believe, in the opening. And it's a story of an Irish woman, slaveholder, who had refugeed to, I believe, Texas with her captives to prevent losing her property. And she hired armed Irishmen to make sure that they didn't run. She was the boss. But in this chapter, you will read about Mrs. Harris, who basically told the law to kiss her ass when it came to disciplining her slaves. She wasn't protecting this person from trauma, harm, and violence, or even death. She was protecting her, the value of her property. So this chapter basically shows us how white women were stay-at-home slaveholders. It showed how white women created a comfort zone for themselves when they sold, bought, or traded trafficked human beings. The only thing I can say about this is sadistic. So with advertisements and records, the author was able to illustrate how white women were able to create a network that was built off of the breasts of black women. Physical labor, wombs, and breasts. You also get to understand the maternal violence white women contributed to, and how differently they viewed a grieving white woman and a grieving black woman. A grieving black woman had the sulks, and it was just, But a grieving white woman, it was poor thing. Chapter 6, the omen took delight in sell and slave. That's really basically about how the slave market in the industrial districts where they had, it was a center point in an event, how large and how important it was to slaveholders and anyone, white people, that wanted to go spend some money. So not only could you traffic human beings, you could buy household goods, you could buy land, you could buy dresses. Sometimes if you didn't have the money, you could use flesh to get a dress. So while white men had a little niche for themselves called the fancy trade, where they would just go and buy mixed women for sex work, white women were like, let me get a house and let me get these women in there and I can continue to make money off of them. Yeah. So, chapter 7, her slaves have been liberated and lost to her. I called, please, government, don't take my identity. This chapter shows how Lincoln coddled human traffickers, and by not just freeing enslaved people, he had to create military policies that weakened the Confederacy. So it was systematic. During this time, Southerners were given an opportunity to pledge allegiance to the Union in order to hold on to their property. So basically, they sold out their people for their individual wealth. This chapter showed the emotional dysregulation that was building due to white folks seeing the loss of their identity in the horizon. Chapter 8, a most unprecedented robbery. I like to call, I am nothing without black people. So this chapter basically illustrates how when black people, were freed, a flood of white tears followed, which included unaliving themselves and or wanting to unalive themselves. The journals, diaries, correspondence with formerly enslaved people's children, as well as their own testimony, gave insight to the emotional state of Southerners once they no longer had an identity. It also clearly showed how white people would rather unalive themselves with free black people around them. Most importantly, it illustrated in their own words, they weren't scared to free black people. They just didn't want them to be free. So I created a study guide that you can find all of it on my Patreon, which is for free. This video, my favorite parts and the critical thought are the only videos. Everything else is going to be just documents. The answers that I give, now our answers may not be the same. I'm just trying to provoke thought here. My answers, though, you need the 99-cent subscription. And argue with your mama, not me. If I am receiving some feedback and people enjoy what I'm doing here, you will need to show that through a free subscription on my Patreon, because I'm not going to be loading this stuff up on TikTok. They're not going to get any of this. So this is just a taste of what my book studies are about. It's really about diving deep into the history of not just our country, but the institutions. So that way, when I do my critical thought, we'll be able to connect the past with today, because you'll see in my critical thought, the women of the past are exactly the women of today.